Hello everybody, welcome back to another Thomas Apologia video. In today's video, we are going to be reacting to a very well-studied individual. This man is so intelligent that he decided to make a podcast on YouTube. His name, of course, Joe Rogan. Before I roll the clip, you guys have 10 seconds to comment down below what you think Joe Rogan's best objection to Christianity will be. Is it A, Christianity was started by guys that loved mushrooms? B, the Bible was invented by Emperor Constantine? Or C, Jesus didn't actually exist? Now let's find out which one of you was actually correct.
Old Testament guy or New Testament guy? Well, the New Testament. No, the New Testament was made by Constantine, who was a Roman emperor who wasn't even Christian. He didn't even believe it. He became a Christian on his deathbed. Like, that's when he became a Christian. Like, all these people that are, like, really into the New Testament. And, like, I'll talk about Old Testament, and people get mad at me on Twitter. You understand what the difference is between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because the New Testament is utter. It's created by a bishop and an emperor. That's a fact. That's like established religious fact. Like, everyone knows where it came from. And not only that, it was written hundreds of years after the death of Jesus. So what are you talking about? Because if you're talking about the old stuff, you got to go deep. Go to the Dead Sea Scrolls and tell me if you basing your life on that.
So let's actually respond to the claims of Joe Rogan now. His first claim is that Constantine became a Christian on his deathbed. However, this is indeed untrue, as any source will tell you. Constantine converted to Christianity well before his death. For example, according to this academic paper published by the University of Western Oregon, Constantine converted to Christianity whilst receiving visions at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312. For reference, Constantine died in 337 AD. The only truth we can charitably attribute to Joe with this is that Constantine wasn't baptized until before his death in May of 337 AD. Now, the second claim that he makes is that it is apparently a fact that the New Testament was created by a bishop and an emperor.
Created by a bishop and an emperor. That's a fact. That's like established religious fact.
You're finished. You're finished. You're finished. You're finished. Wallahi, you're finished.
We can assume that he is alluding to the Emperor Constantine here, as he previously mentioned him, and, well, I can only assume Joe is alluding to the famous conspiracy theory that at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD that was presided over by the Emperor Constantine, that they created and canonized the Bible with the presiding bishops. However, there's a few key issues that I'm going to give you with this claim. First issue is that there are no historical records contemporaneous to this time that record anything like this happening at the Council of Nicaea. The second issue is that this conspiracy isn't first mentioned until at least a millennium after the council, and it was popularized by a book published in 2003 called The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, which is actually a fiction book. Third point here is that the Council of Nicaea was actually called to settle Christian disputes on the doctrines of Arianism versus Trinitarianism, which has nothing to do with canonizing or creating the Bible. Fourth problem is that there are vast numbers of New Testament manuscripts which exist well prior to 325 AD. For example, Papyrus 32, 46, 66, 77, and 103, as well as Majuscule GA 0189, and even more, all exist prior to this time between the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And my fifth and final point on this part of the video is that the Bible is cited by many fathers of the early church, hundreds of years prior to Constantine. For example, Polycarp in his writings quotes 17 of the 27 books of the New Testament before his death in 155 AD. This is not uncommon for the church fathers to quote the New Testament like this, as many fathers prior to the Council of Nicaea, such as Irenaeus, Clement, and Ignatius, quote the Bible throughout their writings. So in order for Joe Rogan's claim here to be true, Constantine would have had to have altered all of the writings of the early church fathers, as well as all the early New Testament manuscripts, and then convinced all the Christians to sign on board with this, even though these Christians have suffered and died for their beliefs in the previous centuries. I think that that is a stretch of a claim. Lastly, Joe claims that the documents of the New Testament were wrote hundreds of years after Christ. However, this is untrue and no longer prevalent in modern scholarship. For example, scholars such as Dr. Adolf Harnack, Daniel Wallace, Michael J. Kruger, etc. disagree with this claim that it was wrote hundreds of years later. For example, Dr. Adolf Harnack argues that because the book of Acts, which is wrote after the Synoptic Gospels, ends uncharacteristically and anticlimactically in 62 AD, the Synoptic Gospels must also predate this point, meaning that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke must have predated 62 AD. Second point is that the language of the Gospels indicate that they are wrote in a pre-persecution era, prior to the first great Roman persecution in 64 AD, due to their kind of portrayals of Romans, such as the centurion Matthew chapter 8, in a favourable light, rather than later works such as the Book of Revelation, still in the 1st century by the way, which portrays the Romans in less of a great light than these books do. Third point is that in his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, scholar Dr. Richard Borkham notes that the 10 most common 1st century Palestinian names almost perfectly correlate with the percentages used for the most common names in the New Testament. Now, if someone was trying to write a later work of fiction, it would be almost impossible to be able to guess the names of people prior to the centuries before them, especially without internet resources to access. We can see things like this, for example, in fictional works which try to create a narrative from a previous point in time, such as fictional works about Apollonius. But the fourth point is that in Matthew chapter 17, it records a 1st century currency exchange correctly between Jesus and Peter. Yet a later account would have no access to be able to fabricate such information. So, for example, imagine trying to record a transaction from pesos to US dollars in a few hundred years prior to this year, and bear in mind you have to do so without the internet. It would be a pretty tall feat in order to be able to do so. Fifth point and final point is that scholar Colin Hemmer records that the book of Acts in its final 16 chapters gets 84 1st century historical facts correct, such as proper names, slang terminology, specific landmarks, variations in language, and proper titles for officials. This point would show that the author of Luke, who wrote the 3rd Gospel, is extremely familiar with 1st century history and likely wrote his account in this era. And if it's true that Luke wrote his account in the 1st century, and his account, according to scholars, is the 3rd of the Gospels, then at the very minimum the Synoptic Gospels came in the 1st century, which shows that Joe's claim is completely wrong. But if you guys did enjoy this video, please like, comment, subscribe, and turn that notification bell on. In today's video, we debunked Joe Rogan's claim that the Bible was a later document composed by the Emperor Constantine. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and with that being said, God bless you all.